Welcome to this edition of Live at the Archives. A free-flowing, sometimes probing, forum of discussion viewed through the prism of our individual perceptions, and hopefully enriching your understanding by seeing a broader spectrum of the human experience.
Potion for love, telling him I'm sincere and that there's nothing too good for us.
Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
Yes, sir.
Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss.
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is?
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
The scene from the movie Selma that you just saw is symbolic of what it was like for African Americans to try or attempt to register to vote before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you students were here, I would direct your attention to the scene of that setting. What do you notice about the scene and about the tone of the clerk there in the courthouse? Your responses might be something like, the courthouse was empty, there was no one there but her and him. He tried to humiliate her. The questions that were asked were questions that were not reasonable and would not be asked of white people who were wanting to register to vote. She probably was there by herself because she would not have been allowed to be there during regular hours when whites were there. She would not have been able to stand in line or get in the same, get there at the same time as others. So that is why she probably was there. And you noticed also that the clerk had a threat there when he said, you want me to tell your boss that you were down here making trouble? That's a threat. It's a way of intimidating people and intimidating people who want to register or people who are attempting to vote. This was not her first time, Annie Mae's first time being there to register, because she said, you know, I know this time. And he said, you have it right, you know when I say you have it right. And so this was another way of intimidating her. And then when he asked her who the judges were and how many there were, and when she knew how many there were, he said, name them. And that would have been 65. So those were the type of questions that were unreasonable. Just another way of denying them the right to register to vote. Today we're going to look at the history of voter registration and voting for African Americans in the United States. we will start by defining some of the terms that go with that voting history. And I'll start with the one, voter intimidation, which is what was used with this clerk in this courthouse. But voter intimidation is just a way of using threats and coercion to intimidate a person for the purpose of interfering and helping to deny them the right to vote. And there are many ways that people can do that. Physically, they can intimidate people by blocking the polls, blocking the voting places. They can use threatening language where they're near the voting places, voting areas, yelling at people, making them feel uncomfortable so that they might get out of the line, disrupting or interrogating them, questioning them about the choices they're making, looking over their shoulder when they're voting, speaking false information about voting requirements, and other types of harassment. And this was especially toward non-English and also people of color.
Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in little over a decade, that promise was gone, replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
I'm not ashamed of the segregated and Jim Crow experience, all because we were able to devise techniques for survival that permitted us to abide our time and to wait until our change come.
As most blacks were willing to bide their time, some began to fight back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they embarked on an uncertain campaign to secure voting rights, build their own communities, schools, businesses, and churches, and to demand redress against mob violence and lynching. White supremacy, the power behind Jim Crow, appeared invincible. And over the next decade, the violence against blacks would grow even more horrific. But black Americans continued to battle, using the power of the press and ultimately the power of the courts to pursue their quest for freedom and equality against racism. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is their story, the story of strong men and women who would never accept the demeaning, threatening, and perilous world of Jim Crow. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of those who, in the face of unending terror, achieved triumphs. Triumphs that would in time make America a better place, not just for themselves, but for all of us.
So I want to share with you today a woman who came to St. Joseph, Missouri, and her name was Kelsey Beshears. Mrs. Beshears was born in West Virginia, and she also had an interest in social work. She went to school where she received her teaching certificate from Bluefield Colored School Institute of West Virginia. And note, I said Bluefield Colored School because at this point in time, the coloreds had to go, which is what they were called at that time, to one school, and then whites also went to a different school. They did not mix and go to school together. So in 1946, Mr. Beshears and Mrs. Beshears, they moved to St. Joseph. So now they're living here, They are becoming active in trying to desegregate a lot of the segregated activities and events and public places. She becomes very active in the NAACP in 1950. So much so that Mrs. Beshears starts the local group here in St. Joseph, Missouri. She also organized many boycotts as well as some of the other events, and she would go downtown and she would get a group of people and they would protest the restaurants that would not serve black people.
We couldn't go to movie theaters. The only one theater in town would allow us in, and then we had to sit up in the balcony. That was in St. Joe. If you wanted to go out and eat dinner at a restaurant, well, you could work there, but you couldn't go and eat there.
Even our Catholic Church was segregated. So we had a lot of segregation in St. Joe.
Because I'm under mind that if you don't learn from the past, then you're just going to repeat it in the future.
It was a time when segregation and separation were both the spirit and law of the land. Negroes attending local theaters were directed to sit in the balcony. Public swimming pools were off limits. And you could spend your money at the lunch counter of the Five and Dime as long as you took your food and ate it elsewhere.
In 1961, Dr. Rufus Beshears dies. In 1961 also, 7 youth and Mrs. Beshears were arrested for demanding a ticket at the Missouri Theater. 1968 and 70, through those years, she began the development of the Brookdale East Apartments. These apartments are still on Messany Street, and it is a housing complex there, which was finished in 1970. Many people live there. Maybe some of you as students may live there, but she started those apartments and she owned those.
She did not tolerate acts of segregation. She didn't believe in violence. She was not afraid to speak out when things needed to be said. When she fought to get those rights for just one segment of society, the whole society benefited from that.
We admire and honor Mrs. Kelsey Beshears, a courageous woman who led the way down the road to equality for all St. Joseph citizens.
You to live again in a poor neighborhood. So it's a very vicious cycle. In 1776, the nation signed a huge promissory note. In this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Sometimes history takes matters into its own hands.
In the Chinese language, the symbol for misfortune is the same as the symbol for opportunity. Let's make this our opportunity. How could we prove that segregation is unfair to our clients?
Harold, what would you do if a car runs into your client's car?
I try to prove damage to my client and his car.
How, Harold?
I put expert witnesses on and they testify as to how much damage was done. Doctors, police, auto mechanics, whatever.
That's what we have to do here. Show that our clients are irreparably damaged by being forced to attend these doghouse schools. Their minds are what's damaged. It isn't easy to prove something we can't see.
Very good. Kenneth Clark.
Go to it.
Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark, husband and wife, African-American psychologists, conducted important research among black children in the 1940s using dolls to study children's attitudes about race. The doll experiment involved a child being presented with two dolls. Both of these dolls were completely identical except for their skin and hair color. One doll was white with yellow hair, while the other was brown with black hair. The child was then asked which doll they would like to play with, which one is the nice doll, which one looks bad, and which one is good. The experiment showed a clear preference for the white doll among all children in the study.
There is a caste system in the United States. And I use the term caste with an E, similar to the castes in India. And the lowest class, the untouchables in the American context, were the African Americans. Native Americans could be lumped in there as well. And one of the aspects of the caste system is that those in the lowest level are deprived of the resources and various other aspects, the benefits of society. And so with segregated schools, because the African American schools were under-resourced, that meant that the people in power did not allocate the amount of money and other resources to those schools that the white schools got. So all the way along the line, in terms of number of teachers, number of money spent, the school books, for example, when the school books got old and tattered in the white schools, then they went to the black schools.
They didn't have a women's prison when I went to the penitentiary up in Jefferson City. They had the walls. They called the prison in Jefferson City the walls, L Hall, Ranch Farm, and Church Farm. That's all they had. That's the only place, the only institutions they had. And while we were there, although it was segregated, you got to remember it was totally segregated. Yeah. The whites lived in cell houses. We lived packed in 7 and 8 in a cell. We had rooms half the size of this. I tell you what, half the size of this room here, cut it off here, with one toilet in it, and 4 or 8 people in there. Yeah. Or when you went to take a shower, you took a shower with maybe 100 people. Sometimes the water cut off. You didn't have no heat. Yeah. During the winter time, yeah. And the yard was separated. The whites had regular weights. We had, the railroad wheels on railroad cars with an iron bar. That's what we lifted. Was that we got bigger and stronger than they did. We couldn't go in the yard. They had a good yard and everything. Yeah. They would put you in a room, let's say, with a hole in the floor. That's where you defecated, urinated. A window with bars on it, no glass or nothing. Threw a blanket in there. I don't care if zero weather. That's how you survive. Yeah. You got to understand, it was rough. It was rough, yeah. And even when you went in the dining room, you went in to eat, it was separated. The whites ate on one side, the blacks ate on the other side. Yeah, it was totally separated. The whole thing was total concept separated. Yeah, but it changed. Because I know when we went to Mobley, we went down to Mobley and met a couple of people, came in, and I was in the Nation of Islam. A lot of people didn't know that. See, I was in the Nation of Islam. I should be a captain in the Fruity Islam. But what we did was, we filed lawsuits and we went in the Missouri State Supreme Court. And by winning in the Missouri State Supreme Court, when we was in the walls, they said that we had a right to practice our religion.
Best barbecue, yeah.
Best barbecue in town, Casa Loma. So what was it made you think that you could be a writer?
I just knew in my head that I was good enough. I just knew it. Anybody just didn't have to tell me. It's just something I felt, that I was good enough. And so I felt I belonged, so I went, I got the opportunity to be a writer, and I figured once I got my foot to do it, I was going to do the best job I could. And I was going to stay, because when I first got hired, I just for 6 months this internship. Then it turned into the year, and then it turned into my career. But when I got there, I was bound and determined I was going to stay.
Was there any times that you were discouraged? Things happened that kind of made you think maybe I can't do that?
Well, not internally or anything, but there may be some outside forces or something, maybe, but I can't think of any, because I was just...
You never lost your resolve then?
No, never. I always knew I was good enough. And that's it. I just got to believe in yourself, you know. And as I did, I knew I belonged there.
Did you receive resistance?
Oh, man. I had got a lot of stuff there from the black and white community. You know, folks didn't think I need to be there, and you know, and all this stuff. And you had racists, and you had blacks, that just, you know, and because I stuttered too, everybody thought, well, I was a dummy, you know, too. You know, so I had that strike against me. And there are a lot of kids that don't know what it took for them to get to this point. You know, equal rights schools, and you know, go to restaurants and everything. But they need to know these struggles, and other people went through it before them, just for them to have this right. You can't drop the ball now, because with these other people before you drop the ball. So you can't say, oh, I can't do this because of this, I can't do it because of that. Well, yeah, the answer is to face more than you ever have. And now you saying you can't do something? No. So that's why it's important that you read your history. I don't know how you got to this point.
See, you know, we know the process of education for the African American in the early years. The education was based on inferiority. Okay, it was inferiority, just like you say, when you see the Caucasian man or the European as conqueror, and you seeing yourself as a slave as being subdued. You know what I mean, menial jobs, doing what I mean, serving other people. Okay, these types of relegations, so relegating people to those particular levels, okay, it just automatically creates an inferior atmosphere. And then when you have it on the scale of the American, the society, then it's there. Meaning that the books, the material that you read where there was an exclusion of the African American presence in your books, other than seeing your people or your nationality in a stereotypical fashion. It's just class distinctions, those types of things. It still does the same thing to people. But even today, in this time when you go into the classroom where African Americans don't see themselves in the front of the room at the blackboard teaching from the blackboard. We have that problem here right now in the St. Joe school system. Okay, very few black educators in the school system, but they don't teach the culture. Okay, so and I think that's the first education is to the individual is the knowledge of self. That's the first education that a person should get, is the knowledge of himself, his culture, his language, his family. If you don't know that, then you have no roots. You have no roots. What we see and what we read has an internal effect on the individual for their cognition, the cognition in the world. So if you see yourself in an inferior position, then it automatically makes you feel inferior to a degree. Like I said, when you start, you are what you eat. So what you learn, that's what you grow up with, that becomes your cognition. Okay, until you get older. Until you get older and you learn something different, but you still carry that inferiority thing back here. But now we know our history. Now we know our history, which makes it better. So it puts everybody else in this day and time on equal footing for as how we feel about one another. I'm just as good as you are. You just as good as I am. That person's no better.
Live at the Archives is produced by the Black Archives Museum, a division of the St. Joseph Museums, founded by Jewel and Geraldine Robinson, preserving stories of the tragedies and triumphs of the area Black community. These are the stories of people like you and me, along with the places and things that make up who we are. The stories are about us, for us, and hopefully enlighten all of us. Through this program, our aim is to bring those stories alive. This is Live at the Archives.
I think you're also the
Come on. And this is a G. Wilkes presentation.